Hi there, and welcome to this blog where I'm going to be talking a little bit about index numbers. My name's Gareth. Well, what I'm going to be looking at in this blog is an example of how we can use index numbers to inflate and to deflate cash flows. Basically to get cash flows that are at different points in time into comparable terms. Well, my name is Gareth. I'm Managing Director with First Intuition, one of the UK's premier accountancy training colleges. My email address is garethjohn@fi.co.uk. You're more than welcome to drop me an email if you've got any questions. I also use Twitter a lot, so you can follow me at AAT Top Tutor. I tweet lots of links to relevant resources, online lectures like the one that we're working through here on index numbers. I answer student queries on Twitter, sometimes give motivation and inspiration, so do feel free to follow me, tweet me if you've got any questions. Now, over the last few years, First Intuition, we've been very, very proud. We've won UK Accountancy College of the Year 3 times in the last 5 years, in 2010, 2012 and 2014. So even years look fairly lucky for us. We're the first college to ever achieve that 3 times in 5 years. I was very proud to be awarded UK Accountancy Lecturer of the Year back in 2011, and we were also nominated for the Study Resource of the Year in 2013, so hopefully you're in safe hands here. Well, let's have a look at the example I'm going to be working through on index numbers, and what we've got here is we've got a 5-year period, you can see, with material costs, and what you'll notice is the material costs have been rising from year 1 through to year 5, from £57,500 up to £72,900. But the thing is, prices do tend to rise. We have inflation that tends to affect prices, tends to mean the increase from one year to the next. So it's perhaps not surprising those material costs have gone up. That's kind of what we would expect, just like most people would expect their salaries to go up every year. Does that actually mean the material cost is going up? Well, not necessarily. You can see we've also given information on the price index. Now, the price index, you can see, has risen from 124.6 at year 1 up to 151.8 in year 5. And the fact that price index has risen quite significantly here does show us there's been a reasonable amount of inflation, and so the material costs would be expected to rise. That doesn't necessarily mean that the real costs are actually going up when you take account of that inflation. Essentially what we're saying is that these different costs, because they're affected by different index numbers, they can't really be compared directly. I can't really compare the 57,500 in year 1 to the 72,900 in year 5 because they've got such different price index values. What we need to do is make adjustments for them to give us our material costs in a more comparable way. And the way we're going to do that here is by showing all of the costs in year 3 prices. And when you're doing tasks and assessments, obviously you've got to be very careful about which year they're looking at you to do them in terms of. Here we could have been looking at anything from year 1 up to year 5, but in fact we're looking at year 3 prices. Now what that means is that the only cost that we don't need to play around with is the year 3 material cost. That will already be in year 3 prices because that was the cost in year 3. So in fact there's no working required for year 3. The material cost is just the 65,700. So I always start by looking at the year that we're doing all of the prices in terms of. That's a good easy starting point. However, we are going to need to adjust the other 4 years' costs to reflect the fact that in each of the other years there was a different price index. Now I'm going to split my calculations into 2 here, because what you'll perhaps notice is that in years 1 and 2, which were the years before year 3, you'll hopefully notice that the price index figures are below the 139.2. We've then got the 2 years after year 3, years 4 and 5, obviously, where you'll notice the price index figures are above the 139.2. So we're actually going to need to do very slightly different calculations with the figures that are before year 3 from what we do for the figures that are after year 3. Well, let's start with years 1 and 2. Now, in years 1 and 2, you can see that the material costs we suffered were lower than in year 3, at only 57,500 or 63,100 respectively. They're both lower than 65,700. That's perhaps unsurprising because the price index figures were lower as well. They were only 124.6 and 131.5. They're both lower than 139.2. That means that the material cost in those earlier years have not been affected by as much inflation. They're likely to be lower, aren't they? So what we need to do is we need to adjust these figures to give them in year 3 prices. We're basically going to need to increase them a bit to account for the fact that by year 3 the price index had risen. These figures we will need to inflate. Inflate means to increase. Now, the way we inflate figures, I've just reminded you of what you've hopefully seen already at this stage, the calculation for inflating figures. What we do is we take the cash flow that we're trying to inflate. So for instance, if I start working on year 1, we've got the cash flow, which was the material cost of 57,500 in year 1, but that is in year 1 prices. Year 1 prices were only at a price index of 124.6, whereas by year 3 the price index has climbed to 139.2. So what we're then going to do is we're going to multiply by the index in the later period, which is the year 3 index that we're trying to get everything in terms of, divided by the index in the earlier period, which is the 124.6 for year 1. Now, what you'll hopefully notice is that when we're inflating figures, when we're trying to increase earlier years' costs, can you see we're putting the higher index figure at the top of the formula, which should mean we end up with a higher resulting figure. Now, if you do £57,500, the year 1 cost, multiply by 139.2, then divide by 124.6, I get an inflated cost figure of £64,238. I'll do it to the nearest whole pound there. But what you'll hopefully notice is I have increased or inflated the figure. We've taken 57,500 and increased it to £64,238. That's what the material costs in year 1 would have cost at year 3 prices, so incorporating that increase in the index. And you see that figure is actually then a lot closer to the year 3 material cost. Well, if you haven't already done so, why don't you pause me for a minute or so while you have a go at year 2. Same basic process. See if you can inflate year 2's material cost figure up to year 3 prices. Well, if I take year 2's material costs of 63,100, we're then going to multiply by, and again it's the index in the later period, which is again my year 3 index, that's what I'm trying to get everything in terms of, divide by the index in the earlier period, which in this case is year 2, so divide by 131.5, so if I take 63,100 times 139.2 divided by 131.5, I now get an inflated material cost figure for year 2 of £66,795. Now again, you can see I've increased the cost. I've increased the 63,100 up to 66,795. And this is very typical. Normally when you're looking at earlier years, so in this case years 1 and 2, I'm going to be inflating them up to year 3 terms, so I'm going to be increasing those figures. And in fact, if you now compare the year 2 cost to the year 3 cost, can you see that actually year 2, the material costs are actually higher than in year 3 when you've accounted for the inflation. So the 2 years before year 3 we need to inflate. The 2 years after year 3 we need to do something a bit different with, because you'll notice that the Figures for year 4 and year 5, we've got 67,300 and 72,900. They're both now higher than year 3, and that's because we've got higher price index figures. Inflation has continued to drive prices upwards, so it's hardly surprising that the material costs going up. These figures are not really comparable to year 3. Now these figures are going to need to be reduced or deflated. I'm going to deflate years 4 and 5 back to what they would have been before the additional increase in the price index. Now to deflate figures, well, the equation looks fairly similar, but it's got a very subtle and crucial difference, is we take the cash flow. So for instance, again, if I do year 4, I've got 67,300 was the material cost in year 4, but that would have been affected by an increase in the price index from year 3. So we're going to deflate it, and we do that by multiplying, and you'll notice it's the other way round this time. It's the index in the earlier period. Now the earlier period is year 3. We're trying to take it back to the previous year at 139.2 over the index in the later period, which for year 4 is now 145.7. Now what you'll notice this time is that the figure on the top of the little equation is actually the lower index number. This means we're going to now decrease the cost or deflate it. So if I take 67,300 multiplied by 139.2, then divide by the 145.7, I now get a deflated cost of 64,298. You see the way that we've reduced the cash flow. We've reduced the 67,300 down to only 64,298. We're effectively knocking off a bit of the inflation that would have affected that cash flow. Well, similar idea. Do you want to have a bash at year 5? Just pause me for a minute or two while you see if you can now deflate the 72,900 for year 5. Well, at 72,900 is the material cost in year 5, but that will have been affected by a further increase in the price index. You can see year 5's actually got the highest price index of any of the years, so perhaps unsurprising the material cost is the highest. So we multiply by the index in the earlier period, which is again the year 3 index, so we're trying to get everything back to the 139.2 over the index in the later period, this time year 5, which is the 151.8, so £72,900 times 139.2, and then divide by the 151.8, and I get that as a deflated figure of now £66,849, again reducing the material cost, because we're this time knocking off some of the effect of inflation. And what we've now got in this final column is we've got all of the figures shown in year 3 prices. So the year 3 figure we didn't need to mess around with. The year 1 and 2 figures we needed to inflate or increase, because at the time of year 1 and 2 the price index figures were lower than in year 3. And then for years 4 and 5, we've had to deflate the figures. We've had to account for the fact that their price index figures were higher, so we've had to knock off a little bit. But in fact, in terms of these two equations that we've been using, what you may already have noticed is that when you actually apply the equations, can you see that regardless of whether you're looking at years before or after year 3, can you see it's always the year 3 index that goes at the top of the formula? So in years 1 and 2, it was the year 3 index we put at the top, and in years 4 and 5, it was the year 3 index we put at the top. So a simple way to remember it is you take the cash flow you're trying to change, and whether you're inflating it or deflating it, you multiply by the price index for the year you're trying to get it back to, and then you divide by the price index for the year it actually started at, whether it's before or after, in this case, year 3. Well, I hope that's been of some use. Feel free, as I've said, to get in touch if you've got any questions. Otherwise, maybe I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for paying attention.